I really don't know what to say. I looked into the warm eyes of folk who are either new or who were here last time, and I feel that same warmth. It's a warmth that I felt, in fact, in anticipation, given my last experience here, that for a week and longer, I've been looking forward to joining you. So thank you, Rich, and I don't see Norma, but thank you to Norma as well, and for having me back.
She unfortunately could not be here this morning. Her assistant, Melissa, is here.
Okay.
But she's very pleased to have you back.
And Melissa too. So thank you so much. I have such warm feelings about being here. How do I follow Bob Barsky? But I did say to Bob that I'll find out what he's talking about next time and make some reference to that in whatever I have to say after him. I like Bob, and he's awesome. Right. So some of you will have had the benefit of me talking about Madiba, and some of you won't have, and that's okay either way. So that's fine. Yeah, that's fine. But for those folk who have heard me talk about Nelson Mandela, you do have a sense of the backdrop and the background to the story that I want to tell across the next 6 discussion sessions that I have with you. Yeah. So my intention, ladies and gentlemen, is then to cover in 6 sessions the story of the Truth and Reconciliation Process and Commission in South Africa. It is not going to be a pleasant story. And I can already tell you now that it is not going to be a story that will satisfy you. And quite frankly, it is not a story that will give you perhaps answers that you seek in relation to truth and reconciliation. So I give you that in advance, that I am not necessarily going to satisfy you in ways that you might feel you want to be satisfied. The story that I have to tell is a messy story. It's a contradictory story. In fact, if I had to characterize it in one particular way, if you had to say to me, Clive, how would you characterize the transition to democracy in South Africa? How would you characterize the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa? I would say to you, the word contradictory applies very well. And so I'm going to tell you a story fraught with contradiction, fraught with paradox, fraught with absurdity, in fact, in some instances. A story that may not make sense. But I'm going to tell it nonetheless, because I believe it to be a compelling story. I believe it to be an instructive story. And although we now know, so many years afterwards, also through rigorous academic analysis of what we thought at one point was a best case exemplar of how to do transition, we know now that it had many warts, that it had many problems, that it was fraught with many things that we got wrong. It still, in my opinion, remains a wonderfully instructive experience, also because of all of those analyses, and also because we like to recognize that we didn't get it entirely right, which we didn't. So my first session is, and I make no apologies for this, you may well fall asleep, I don't know, is a theoretical overview. Because the experience, the South African experience now, and in many respects the South African experience triggered this, sits within an entire industry, ladies and gentlemen, known as transitional justice. And so this industry is replete, on the one hand, with practitioners who have certain tools, if you like, methods that they use, that they apply in times of transition, and on the other hand is replete with its own journal and its own theoretical frameworks, etc. And I do want to start there, which is why I say you may fall asleep, because theory is not for everyone. And maybe theory isn't what you came here to hear, but I do think a bit of an understanding helps us contextualize the strangeness of the South African experience. So today I want to dwell a little bit on the theoretical backdrop. After that, we go headlong into a very hands-on description of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission and its functioning. And so the second session will be looking at how it was structured, what were the prevailing attitudes at the time. That is a very interesting thing to begin to think about, what sorts of attitudes there were to this creature known as the TRC at the time, and what sorts of operational principles functioned. And that sounds theoretical, but it's very practical. And of course, it had huge implications for the lives of so many people. The third session, I want to talk about the tensions and the relationships between amnesty, truth, and justice. And I want to demonstrate that also practically by some of the moral and ethical dilemmas which the TRC was faced with at the time. The fourth session, I'd like to talk about reconciliation and truth. So I want to focus that session on one of the primary functions of the TRC, which was reconciliation. And the fifth, I suggest, will be probably our most controversial session. Why is that? Because we'll talk about this interesting question of reparations and how the South African Truth Commission tried to deal with this question of reparations. Yeah. Now, I've left the sixth session open. My proposal is to talk about contemporary South Africa. Are South Africans reconciled? And to get back to the title of, where's the truth, where's the reconciliation, where's the justice, to talk a bit about that. But at the same time, I'm pretty certain that as I proceed, you will have perhaps some things you'd like me to focus on as well. And so maybe by session 3 or session 4, we can take stock, and I can also tailor the last session a little bit to your more specific needs and interests, if that works for you. So does that sound like a good way to proceed? Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. Right. So if we want to think a little bit about a conceptual framework, a way of looking at the TRC, the South African TRC, then the best way for me to do it is indeed then by way of theoretical or conceptual introduction to focus on one aspect of societies in transition, yeah? And that is the law. If we focus, now that's simplistic, but if we do that by way of introduction, what it does if we look at the law, and what I find it does is it helps vivify or bring to life the more dynamic, wider forces that are, of course, part and parcel of any country going through a transition. So I'm going to look in particular at the role and the nature of jurisprudence, of law during a transition, and I do that to bring to life some of the strangeness that is a characteristic, I would suggest an axiomatic characteristic, in fact, of transitional times. And so I guess the question I'm asking is, what are the legal choices that are made during times of transition, and what is the significance of those choices, those legal choices that are made. And of course, in South Africa, we had to make some very fundamental legal choices, which we will describe in subsequent opportunities. So what is the role of law in periods of far-reaching societal change? Now, if we look across the last 20 years, we have this benefit of analyses of transitional societies, which we didn't have, in fact, when I was a practitioner, when I was immersed in some of what Rich described as that very kind introduction. I need to change that introduction. It's far too lengthy and there are far too many things in there. And thank you. I heard you say something about my age and my youth. And when you invoke youth, I think I'm always grateful for that. My kids keep me young, I think. And yes, so obviously I have experienced some of this firsthand, some of this stuff firsthand. In fact, yesterday in class, I was showing my students footage of our negotiation forum, the place we negotiated the new constitution, and I was showing them amateur footage of the right wing, the fascist right wing, then known as the Afrikaner resistance movement, which had driven a tank straight through the front entrance of the negotiation forum, and had then chased us with their rifles, and sought to, of course, potentially murder some of the key negotiators at the time, because the right wing wasn't happy with the compromise that we were making. Because of course a transition is about compromise. A transition isn't about you getting your way or me getting my way. A transition is about us developing something. And they didn't like that. And I remember clearly, and it was hard for me to watch. I promised to show that for like 2 weeks and didn't. Because you can imagine the trauma, when you're chased by tanks and guns and have to hide away under tables because these drunken thugs with their fascist ideology, are chasing you around and wanting to basically get rid of you because they don't agree with, your process, which is all-inclusive, all-encompassing, and genuinely sincere in relation to trying to get to an outcome. So I guess maybe telling that gives you a sense of the reality behind even the theory that I'm proposing here and presenting to you. And so this analysis of law suggests in the first instance that there is a perhaps not so nuanced balancing act between ideal justice on the one hand and political expediency, political power, the political power balances of the time on the other. And if there's anything that I would leave you with today, it is thinking about the ideal form of justice on the one hand, political power during transition on the other, and the tensions, in fact, that push and pull between those two poles. And so we talk about a pragmatic balancing act during times of transition, a pragmatic balancing act that is a balance between ideal justice on the one hand and liberal and power, political power on the other, which together drives what we could call then liberalizing change. The word liberalizing is not meant to be equated with liberal. We're not saying the outcome needs to be liberal, it can be conservative. We're talking about liberation from the injustices of the past. So we're not proposing liberalizing change to mean a particular political complexion, other than we're saying a transition is leaving behind an old order, often a very violent one, a dictatorial one. In South Africa's case, an oligarchic, dictatorial, racist minority regime, leaving that behind for something different. So we're developing an understanding, if you like, of a theory of transitional justice here, which is a bridge. This theory that I want to propose to you today is a bridge between those two ideals. The ideal conceptions of the rule of law on the one hand, and contingent political exigencies of particular cases on the other. And we political scientists, and indeed politicians, oops, I just said that awful word. You know, I could head off on a different tangent right there. We could go down that accountability path. Yeah, we could go down that path too. We call this political compromise, this bit between. So are there general characteristics of periods of transition? Are there things that we can draw out from countries that have experienced transition? Are there things that we can say are general characteristics? Is it true to say that they all follow a distinctive paradigm? Is it true to say that rule of law principles guide transitions? Is it true to say that they are tailored to the goal of political transformation? Well, we begin to suggest that it isn't as simple as that, and that law develops, adjusts, and is shaped as much by political change as vice versa, and that law, in fact, adjusts and is shaped in a pragmatic fashion. So rather than clinging to these ideal conceptions of law, what ideal law might be, we see that law begins during times of transition to exhibit characteristics which are driven as much by the political requirements, the exigencies of the day, as by anything else. Yeah. And this is going to become very real when we describe the very real South African experience. So this is me putting in theoretical and almost polite form what you're going to see in terms of video and what I'm going to describe. And by the way, I should say that I had a lovely student who catalogued for me the entire Truth and Reconciliation Commission's video footage that is online. Yeah, it runs to 37 pages with the links in the document and descriptions. She was amazing. She was fantastic. She got an A for that piece of work. And I like to share that document. I asked her if I could, and she, of course, said yes. And if you wanted it, I'd be happy to give it to you. I guess I'm giving away part of what we did, which is different to many Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. We washed our dirty laundry in public. Ain't that brave of us? Yeah, not everyone does that. And so we were glued to our television sets when a lot of this strange story was surfaced. We were literally glued to our TV sets and radios. Not everyone has TV in South Africa, by the way. In fact, you're lucky if you have a TV. And so if you, and I will be showing some of that footage in our classes from next week, also to make this real. Yeah. So if you're falling asleep yet with a theory, bear with me. We're going to get to the interesting stuff, I promise. And so as we look at a theory, we begin to explore, if you like, the interplay between law and power politics. And we begin to try and describe and understand what this nexus between those two looks like, what its character is, what constitutes its fabric. Now, there are many other dynamic forces at play. I've chosen law simply because I want to vivify, I want to bring to life some of these challenges. And lest you think that political forces drive the change, I want to get to a theory which suggests that the interplay is such that law also exerts an independent force of it and shaping force of its own. It has an independent potential, in fact, for driving and effecting transformative politics. So if we begin to think about a definitional feature of transitional justice, then I would suggest this. A period of transitional justice aims at grounding within a society a normative shift in the principles underlying and legitimizing the exercise of state power. That's kind of how I would, in academic parlance, describe this emergent theory. So prevailing theories of transitional justice have tended to be antinomic, they've tended to be binary, they've tended to be either one or another of, on the one hand, radically realist. In other words, theories that we've had up to, say, the 2000s, I believe people call this the noughties. Is that right? Have you heard that? It's like you've got the 90s and the 80s and the 70s, and in 2000, what do you call it, the 2000s? I don't know. It's a funny old world. So on the one hand, you have radically realist theories, basically saying political power is all that matters, it's all that drives transition. On the other hand, you have radically idealized theories which suggest that law operates entirely as a self-contained entity in driving social change. And emergent thinking post-2000, when that bug was supposed to change all the clocks. Yeah, you remember that? Emergent theory suggests that neither of these, that this binary way of thinking isn't helpful when we think about what South Africa went through. And it is argued that by definition, viewing a transition in one or another of those two binary fashions excludes what the law and political power together produce in an interplay with each other. Yeah. So what is preferable is to see transitional legal responses in relation to not just legal requirements, but also historical, social, cultural, and of course increasingly global forces. Yeah, I don't want to simplify this. I want to make sure that you're aware of that, and I will be covering those various aspects as we go into the future. But I simply say it is much more complex, but that we look at law to enable us to get to an understanding which isn't one or the other of radically realist or idealist, but gives us an either or, a bit of both, as a way of looking at the South African transition. So if we think about a paradigmatic theory, then a conceptual framework which you can use to hold me accountable and to hold the South African experience accountable, a lens through which you can see what I want to get at when we talk about our experience, then a paradigmatic theory of justice is what we're looking for. A paradigmatic theory of transitional justice is what we now want. Yeah? And before we can talk about these characteristics of that paradigm, in fact, before we can talk about the characteristics of a jurisprudential paradigm, characteristic of what we call an interregnum, yeah, a period from one form of rule to another. And remember that a transition, whilst you might have a government in place, a new government, post-94 we had one, doesn't mean that there isn't an interregnum and that we aren't creating new and developing new institutions, constitutions, institutional structures and so forth. So we talk about a transitional interregnum. That if we look at the classic conception up to perhaps the 2000, we see that classical conceptions of transition suggest that transitions are all about breaking down the past. They're anti-structural. They're interested in breaking down past structures. They're rearward oriented. Transitions look at the past and say, we abhor that past, We hate that past. We don't like those institutions, etc. We want them abandoned. They can lack principle, some of these theories, not in the sense that they lack principle, but that they lack classic legal principles. In other words, classic legal principles don't necessarily apply during transitions. And they, in fact, up to 2000, the thinking was you could not compare countries. There was not a paradigmatic theory of transitional justice. You could not say that there were commonalities between transitions. There was no determinable set of common characteristics. However, we now know that if we think about transitional justice and we do this comparative work, which has of course been done for us, we see that there are patterns, there are regularities, and there are commonalities. Does anyone want to suggest what any of those regularities and commonalities might be? Yes, sir.
Are we talking about things like inalienable individual rights here?
Possibly. 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 Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I think in any transition, there's always a group that held power
Yeah.
through some force. It might have been land, money, or psychological force of this is the way we do things. Well, when you have a change, even to a better situation for everyone, some groups are going to be losing some of their pizzazz or their steam or something. And even though a greater number will benefit, they don't want to, I'm just thinking of tribal things too. They don't care if the tribe is old. They don't want to lose that little tribal thing that they had.
Yeah.
And we can say, well, it doesn't make any sense. It's a changing world. You don't have your power anymore.
Yeah.
But they're still going to have to surrender it in some way. You know?
Thank you so much for that. Yes.
There's an element of upheaval.
Very interesting, absolutely. And I want to focus, in fact, quite strongly on that. Oh, it's hard to hear. So I'm sorry about that. It's hard to hear from that side of the room to this side of the room. I'm going to repeat it in a succinct and pithy way because those were spot on. Those were spot on. And I have conceptual words to cover those. So the last point literally about traditions and someone winning and someone losing and histories is that a common characteristic of transitions is they all have a history. They all have in common a move away from something problematic. So histories is a common characteristic. Emergent legal instruments such as new constitutions are characteristic of these periods of transition. Newly constructed or regenerated bureaucracies is a characteristic, institutions is a characteristic of these interregnums. Reparations, discussions and thoughts and points and questions and unhappiness and upheaval about reparations is a common characteristic. And indeed, even retribution. Yeah, there are people who want retribution. In South Africa, we had folk who wanted retribution. They stormed at us in the World Trade Center. They didn't want what we were doing, or they wanted retribution for something that had happened to them in the past. And of course, you can see to what extent it's a miracle for us that Nelson Mandela averted the degree of revenge that could have been a factor in that process and was, ladies and gentlemen, a real factor. It's not as if, it's not as if it wasn't a factor. It was a big deal. So that there are commonalities in the context of interregnums, and so these transitions are all about normative shifts. Characterized by tensions, if you like, between adherence to established convention, the past, and radical transformation on the other. So this produces what's known as a dialectically induced position. There's a tension between these two positions, in other words. And so what we look for is a theory that can describe this nexus, that can describe this tension, how we navigate between these two contending poles. And what we have, ladies and gentlemen, is a mess. It's a real mess. So what we have is a hybrid position, a hybrid emergent position. That's the clever way, that's the academic way of saying we have a mess. And so we have a hybrid emergent position which occupies this space. Yeah, so we have this pole, we have a hybrid, so we have this hybrid emergent position. And it's, if you want to describe it, I've tried to capture it in a sentence, which is very, very challenging to do. If you want to be succinct and pithy about it, we can say that an emergent theory of justice that does justice to what I want to describe in the case of South Africa is, certainly from a jurisprudential perspective, is, and here we go, because now I'm going to describe the mess, a partial and non-ideal conception of justice. And if you don't have problems with what I'm saying, then I'm going to be surprised, because I got a sentence here saying, when I'm done saying this, I want to ask you how you feel about what I've said. A partial and non-ideal conception of justice comprising provisional and limited forms of constitutions, sanctions, amnesties, reparations, purges, truths, and historical accounts. That doesn't sound satisfactory to me. Does it sound satisfactory to you? Yeah? Thank you. Because most folk will say, wow, yeah, it's a mess, but, it's the best we can do at any given time. Yeah. Often people will recoil when I try to, so this is why I'm doing this theoretical stuff first, because the reality is stranger than fiction. It's almost absurd. And so the way in which I describe this hybrid position is that it's not ideal, it's not perfect. Yeah, and so I've tried to put that in a clever sentence. Yeah. And it sits uneasy with us. It makes us feel uneasy as human beings. The transition made us feel uneasy. That's why when you talk about times of upheaval, you have so many factors playing into that upheaval, including the uneasiness that some of these compromises bring about in everyone. Because no one's fully happy. No one's excited when someone gets amnesty and they're this awful murderer that did these evil things, Or when we talk about reparations, that we say, well, you get $3,000, you lost your mum, your dad, and a few brothers and sisters. Well, hey ho, there you go. It's that cavalier. This sentence means so much more than the textbook sentence that it is. But let me give you the theory, let me give you the picture, and then we're going to get into, we'll listen to testimony, we'll listen to people's views, we'll hear some of what this meant in real life.
Can you do the sentence one more time?
Yes, ma'am, of course I can. And please, all it takes is a hand, and not even that. If you want to interrupt me, just interrupt me at any time. I like that. I'm good with that. Yes, please. I should have said that at the beginning. I like rowdiness. I'm up for any question. I in fact have the answer to every question. But I don't know if I have the right answer. And so please just, interject or ask a question. I'm happy to stop. I'm happy to go in all sorts of directions. So a partial and non-ideal conception of justice, comprising provisional and limited forms, I could have said of outcomes really, of constitutions, sanctions, amnesties, reparations, purges, truths, and indeed even historical accounts. Often no 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 historical accounts are the same. People will recount them in very different ways. And we'll see that. We'll see that. So characteristics of law in transitional times generally include an absence of some of the general legal principles as one would think of them in the way that you might expect them to be applied regularly, generally, stably, and that they might have a uniform prospective outcome. They are both, so the law in transitional times is both backward and forward looking. It isn't just backward looking. It's got to be, in other words, retrospective and prospective in terms of the way it functions. I'm going to talk more about these things. They may sound odd now. The law during transition, also in South Africa, is both continuous and discontinuous. And if one were to summarize this, one would say that one finds, in relation to the law, an ambiguous hybrid state of both and rather than either or. So we reject the binary kinds of understandings in favor of more complexity. And we come to then understand, if you like, a theory of transitional justice as choices that are rule of law choices that are the function of particular historical and political legacies, and that these are all contingent on the politics of the time. Yeah. Now this stuff will all come to reality when I talk about our situation more directly. So we're talking about a bridge between the past and the future, with law playing a transitional, if you like, driver towards a normative liberalizing shift. Yeah. So transitional experiences don't, though, only follow the path prescribed by the political parties in power. At the time in South Africa, you could have said that the political parties that drove the process were the African National Congress and the National Party. And I know many of you will say, Clive, but we know our history and we know there were 25 political parties participating in the negotiation process. Even during that process, the way that sufficient consensus was described was to say if the National Party and the ANC agreed, then that was the way it was going to be. So by and large, you had those two major political parties in the South African case. And even in this instance, it isn't always true to say that it's just about political parties and their power. So you can see this perhaps exemplified by a question. What institution during transitional times has the legitimacy to carry out this transition? And to what extent do transitions in fact vary in the context of the nature of the transition, and in fact also their adherence to law and conventional, if you like, legality? In many instances, the application of law and the interpretation of law is adopted by newly formed institutions. In our case, and today I'm very proud of our Constitutional Court, it was and remains, in fact, the Constitutional Court that is the ultimate arbiter of, and was the arbiter during the interregnum. We didn't have a Constitutional Court. It was a product of our negotiations, a beautiful product. That's part of why I can say the transition was both a success and a failure, but it was a success because we had this. And today, of course, all 11 justices agreed that what Zuma, the president, had done with his house, as someone had observed during the informal chat before this, that was wrong.
But the court couldn't function until you had a constitution.
Yeah.
And the Constitution couldn't be formed without the Reconciliation Committee.
Yes.
So how many years into it was it before the Supreme Court was formed, the Constitutional Court?
We South Africans multitask. And so we ran a lot of those things in parallel. And indeed, in preparation for the final constitution, which happened simultaneous with the TRC, we'd already agreed an interim constitution. So we were keen to get to the new South Africa. So in some respects, seriatim is not the way to think about it. It's more a parallelism of processes and good groundwork in the 4 years of negotiation where we knew that, and in fact, that is another entire series. Because so how did we negotiate? So what was that? What did that look like? How did we manage to run parallel processes rather than, say, well, we first need a constitution? There were arguments about that. There were arguments because the National Party, for argument's sake, never wanted a short negotiation process. It would have loved to extend that process for decades, because of course it didn't want black people to govern. Good heavens, why would you want that? It wanted power sharing. And its early forms of negotiation proposals were all about minority rights and about group rights. They didn't get this thing of individual rights and a Bill of Human Rights and elections that if you win the election, you're in power. They didn't get that stuff. They wanted a government of national unity based on a power-sharing model where they would be guaranteed posts. Yeah, so you can see the extent to which even during the negotiation process there were challenges in relation to outcomes and indeed the processes themselves, because the African National Congress, on the other hand, said, hey, we don't want any of this, we just want an election now, and the majority will decide the constitution. And white folk were terrified. They were completely, whoa, hey, we don't want that.
So how were the justices determined and when were the first ones put in place?
So they were put in place post the election, and they were put in place by Nelson Mandela. Yeah.
So they were appointed?
Yeah, to the newly created Constitutional Court, appointed by the President. Probably 95, 94, 95, something like that. I will come back with exact, because so hey, last time I spoke about the camera. Gets me to philosophical places, that camera. Gets me to, questions of like, how do we, so I don't know, I don't want to go there. And I want to talk about the precursors to the TRC, because these questions are absolutely pertinent, the nature of compromise and the nature of give and take in creating such a strange structure that then came up with some strange outcomes. Because these questions cut directly to the weirdness, if you like, of the transition. So the Constitutional Court was able. So in theory, you can have two ways of looking at this. If legal structures retain legitimacy, ones that existed prior to a transition, they can continue to play adjudicatory roles. In some instances, they are so discredited that you have new institutions like our new Constitutional Court, and they then also can begin to play interpretive roles in relation to the transition. And we will see when we talk about the number of legal challenges from the main political parties, National Party, African National Congress, IFP, Inkatha, when we will see to what extent the law was called upon to deal with those challenges that the TRC faced. And if you heard what I said, so in other words, we didn't just have a TRC and everyone loved it. And we didn't even have a TRC, and the folk who were supportive of it loved it. They took it to court and they challenged it, and we'll talk about some of the challenges, because there were challenges. I mean, what do you think the challenges would have revolved around? Pardon?
Who has power?
Who has power? Things like amnesty as well. So, hey, you murdered my father. I don't want you to get amnesty. I want to take you to court. I want to prosecute you in court. Reparations. So the constitutionality of the very existence of the TRC, which is about power. So this is, we're heading towards interesting times. This is the boring theory. We're heading towards interesting times when we start talking about the strangeness that surrounds. And I keep using that word because, if you thought we just went into a TRC and were happy with it, we didn't. We didn't. So when constitutional courts predate transitions, other institutions generally become the sites, if you like, or drivers for transition. How am I doing for time?
25 minutes.
Okay, jolly good. I think I'm going to move on with this. So during transitions, you have what is known as the politicization of law that can occur. And during deep-rooted, during profound transitions, and I would suggest South Africa as an example of this, you have also what is then known as the hyper-politicization of law. And examples of this are, for example, when you think about punishment or when you think about retribution, you can see that these, and we're talking theoretically now, can be infused with a mix of retrospective and prospective purposes, political purposes. You can see that the law in these times are impacted on, the law is impacted on by political constraints. And certainly the imperatives to punish, the imperatives to grant amnesty, these kinds of things lead to significant but messy tensions. Yeah. So we're talking still theoretically, and we're saying that in most of these transitional cases, when you begin to look at the hyper-politicization of the law, you begin to see this emergent messiness and this discomfort that I was talking about earlier on, that you as an individual, if you are in a transition, begin to feel this dissonance. And all of this is balanced out by the imperative intent of the law seeking a political transformation, seeking a normative shift towards a liberalized state. Yeah. Another tension that you might see is the massive and systemic challenge between, if you like, the mix on the one hand of individual and collective responsibility. Which individuals are responsible for human rights abuses? Which collectivities are responsible for human rights abuses? And the other side of the coin, the messiness that is associated with determining the extent to which individuals receive reparation, or communities and indeed a society receives reparation. So there are tensions there, and in the case of South Africa, there are considerable blurrinesses here that we're going to be talking about. Blurriness between punitive aspects, reparative aspects, administrative aspects, and so forth. And so you have this huge tension, in other words. Law in its transitional form has this hybrid nature, and one wants then to begin to think about the messiness on the one hand, but the end goal on the other, the end state, that which is being striven for on the other hand. And indeed, during transition, political stability in a fragile climate fragile and often febrile climate. A climate still characterized by bellicosity and animosity and indeed revenge, that we're talking about a world that looks like that. And this balance of power, this balance of political power, which you rightly said was a key thing. These are all key considerations in what we call politely the hybridity also of transitional jurisprudence, but more generally the hybridity that is characteristic of a transitional phase. There is no single answer to the question, what is the correct response for my country if it is transitioning from something we didn't want to something what is the correct response? There is no single answer. What are the factors that the answer is contingent upon? We've touched on them already. So the nature of the historical legacy, that will drive to a large extent some of this. Legal culture itself, jurisprudence, of course political traditions, and certainly in that respect then these balances of political power in these times. Right, so let's have a quick look at how law then enables radical transformation during times of transition. So law, where you would think it plays a stabilizing role, doesn't just do that. It plays, during times of transition, both a stabilizing and a destabilizing role. The law isn't there just to provide stability and ensure stability. The law is there also to make provision for instability. That sounds contradictory, doesn't it? It sounds odd. The simultaneous stabilization and destabilization function, I think, probably can be better conceptualized by saying that the law mediates, and remember we're looking for that hybrid position between those poles, so the law mediates between that which was and that which is to come, between the preservation of formal and stable continuity in relation to that which is worth preserving, and creating a legitimate disjuncture with the past, legitimizing the break from the past. And that's why law must both be a stabilizing and destabilizing force, because it seeks, on the one hand, to enable the transition, but on the other hand, to make a break from the past in a legal way. And how does it do that? It does that through indictments, through legal verdicts, through amnesties, through reparations, through apologies, even seeking apologies, through putting in place legal instruments, through lustration, prosecution, pardoning, inquiries, etc. These are all ways in which the law, in a very practical fashion, during a period of transition, as we will see in the South African case, this is how it enables, if you like, and supports a transition. Yeah. And so the success of law is judged by the way it achieves both stabilization and destabilization. Because the extent to which it achieves a separation from the past whilst still providing an integrative function during this turbulent time is a huge challenge for the law. Yeah? The extent to which it does both those things simultaneously, the multitasking stuff, that is how we judge then, all as continuous concurrent processes, how we can begin to determine the success of law in and during transitions. When we talk about stabilizing and destabilizing, the way in which another way to look at this is to see that there's a range of procedures and outcomes that appear not to be fair, not to be right, not to be just. And certainly at first glance, that's the case with South Africa. When you see what we did, you'll think we were insane. Maybe we were. Trials without punishment, or certainly without regular forms of punishment. Reparations that don't make sense and that are characterized by political compromise. Legally arbitrary decisions that seem arbitrary. Limited sanctions or indeed no sanctions. These are all things that sit strangely with us and will make us feel uncomfortable, and these are the characteristics of, and have been extracted as the characteristics not only of the South African experience, but generally countries that are going through this kinds of thing. Above all, transitional law is symbolic. And so the role of law during these times often is also symbolic. It's, if you like, a secular sanctification of the rituals which we need to go through in order to get to where we want to be. It's a secular sanctification of the rituals and symbols of transitional political passage. And there's a lot in there about symbolism and transition in the context of rites of passage that enable people also psychologically, with their hearts, to go along with that process. Because remember that what I was saying is this process doesn't necessarily make sense. So why should people go along in that process that is so contradictory, that is so messy, that is so absurd? So the role of law is key during these times. Yes, ma'am.
How useful were our conflict resolution skills in this process?
Thank you so much.
Damn.
Yeah, that's a so. What I would say is, I'll make it very real. I don't think I'd be here in front of you without conflict resolution techniques and practices. The extent to which we went to great lengths to empower at a national level and at a local level negotiators to deal with conflict. It was a huge endeavor. It was an endeavor in which I played a small part. One of the reasons I know every town hall in South Africa just about is because I went and did a lot of that training. I went to almost every small town, so much so that I'd forgotten which town I was in sometimes when I was doing these workshops, teaching folk that there are ways of dealing with conflict. That expertise had emerged even during the 70s, certainly amongst my black brothers and sisters when they negotiated in the trade unions. And whilst they couldn't effect political change, won many victories in relation to wages and working conditions and so forth, and honed their skills, in fact, in perhaps the more bargaining side of conflict resolution, not actually the bit that we wanted during negotiation, but still, black and white alike saw the benefit of negotiation already during the 70s and the 80s. But then I can describe many initiatives which a group of us applied to enable people to understand the importance of techniques and skills which aren't that hard and which make a huge difference in the way in which people begin to interact. And so if I were to describe to you the negotiation process itself, you would see that from when we started, we had 3 goes at it. We failed twice. We had a thing called CODISA, 2 versions, CODISA 1 and CODISA 2. They both broke down because we didn't know how to resolve conflict. We didn't know what it meant to resolve conflict. Then we had a 3rd go at it, and by then, we, the advisors had some effect. And of course, there were other shifts as well, value shifts, shifts in understanding a shared vision and things like that, which began to gain traction. But the importance of conflict resolution can't be underplayed in relation to a transition like this. And I guess the other thing I would say is in the South African instance, we didn't want international conflict resolvers. And there were many of them. You know, academics love to pile in because they can write a book and they can publish a journal article and they can say they were there and they might even be able to say, hey ho, it was me. And we didn't want, so, and I worked with a number of those academics, by the way. I'm not going to say, they were amazing. They were fantastic insofar as they were able to give us perspectives and so forth, but we wanted local involvement.
Did you ever feel like your life was endangered by groups that didn't want resolution?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure.
You just haven't really indicated that, but I assume you must have.
Yeah, in different instances. I'll show you a film of one such instance if you like. It'll be the second time I show it, and it's hard for me to show it. I showed it yesterday after a 2-week, thinking about whether I'm going to show it in class or not. When the World Trade Center was stormed with these, drunken fascist thugs with their rifles, urinating all over the place, painting slogans all over the place, swastikas. Their emblem was a 3-pronged swastika on a red flag with a white circle. I'll show you. I'll show you. You can see it firsthand, and trust me, I was lucky. There were black folk, who I don't know how they. I worked with a guy who had 7 bullets in his back. I was lucky. I don't even want to talk about my experiences because they were nothing compared to some of the experiences, that folk had. And then the way to put that as well, the other way to answer that is, of course, all our dead brothers and sisters who didn't make it, who actually paid the ultimate price, because they were brave enough to go and do stuff in the streets. They were brave enough to stand up to that, that regime at the time, and were abducted. So why did we have a TRC? This is a great question because the kinds of human rights abuses, systematic human rights abuses, under a system that was already evil. Apartheid is evil in and of itself. Yeah, and the UN has told us that, but we don't need the UN to tell us that. And then compounded by a military, a police state that murdered millions, certainly hundreds of thousands, of black South Africans, simply because they dared have a vision. They dared in 1955, ladies and gentlemen, to have a vision of an all-party convention of all the races, as they put it in the language of the time, to sit down together and negotiate a new South Africa. They dared have that vision. Z.K. Matthews, living here in your country in the US in 1953, he came back to South Africa because the South African government wouldn't renew his passport. He couldn't stay here. He had lunch with his sons and he said, you know what, we need an all-party convention in this country. 1953. We need everyone to get together, black and white alike, to figure it out. Do you know what happened to him? He was put up on a charge of treason. Yes, sir, he was put up on a charge of treason. But look what we did in 1990. Was it different to what he was saying? Was it any different? And so you see that I hardly even care about myself in the answer to that question, because it literally, the magnitude of the answer, Mandela spent 27 years in jail. Let me tell you, Mandela had come face to face, as did South Africans. We South Africans, we had to come face to face with this question, which Mandela did. let's get rid of the law. Let's plant bombs. Mandela created an armed wing of the African National Congress called the Spear of the Nation, Umkhonto weSizwe. Why did he do that? Do you think he wanted to do that? He didn't. He agonized over that. The party agonized for some 2 years over that. It wasn't as if, and then when the party finally agreed, they said, hey, actually, Mandela, you need to go do that on your own. We don't want to be associated with that military wing of yours. So you get to this question about political violence. When is political violence justifiable as a way in which you want to achieve a social change? And of course, everyone has to answer that for themselves. But we know how it was answered in the South African instance. And so we know that political parties and their constituencies across the board committed human rights violations. Now, I say that just because the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was challenged also on that, and it was challenged on its bias. We're going to get to all this fun stuff. But of course, if you look at who committed the widest range of human rights abuses, then in my view, the answer is quite straightforward. Starting with the original sin in 1652, which is, of course, the 6th of April, 1652, is when, Jan van Riebeeck, a Dutchman, landed at the Cape, founded a victual station to put provisions on ships that were then sailing to trade in India with slaves. From then onwards, of course, we have that history. And that's why I think I might have started a previous session, I don't know, when I was saying, actually I don't know if I started it or not this way, but I'll say it now anyway. It is such a shame on us that we had a TRC. Shame on us as South Africans that we had a TRC. And how can I say that? Because of course I'm proud of the fact that we had a TRC, and shouldn't I be proud that we did that? And do you see now what I mean about contradiction? Do you see how that contradiction sits just quite really here in my heart? Where I have to come in front of the public and I have to say, ladies and gentlemen, we had an amazing TRC. Man, I'm so ashamed of it at the same time. It's like, we bear that scar and we won't ever get rid of that scar, no matter how much vitamin E we use to rub on it. It's never going to go away. It's huge. So sorry, I've given you a long answer, but I thank you for the question.
I do have to just say, though, that I watched the televised versions of it, and I was absolutely amazed. It was the most meaningful, moving thing I've ever seen, and I thought, my gosh, this might save them. But I didn't have any perception of all of the complications that went with it. It was just the experiences of it that moved me.
Yeah, thank you. And everyone was able, globally and locally, to watch it because it was televised and broadcast around the entire world. If Rich stands up, I know I'm almost there.
2 minutes. 2 minutes.
So I don't know if there's a last question because I know I'm almost there. And yes, ma'am.
It seems like when you were saying about, I don't have
They can't hear on the other side.
It seems like when you're talking about multitasking and contradictions and stuff, you have to give people committed to a process that may not decide in their favor now, but to have faith in the process and promote the process will have benefits for the whole society, thereby benefiting them. But we're so individualistic and we're so egocentric. If we can't see the benefit for us right now, it's so hard for us to see that the process is going to help the whole. And I don't know anything about South Africa, except I love Mentzel, and I love resolution of conflict. But the thing is, you have to be committed to that process, that it's going to work eventually for everyone, it's like delayed gratification. So if the things that you did in training, if that gets people committed to the idea that this will work for you long term, even if it doesn't benefit you short term, then you'll have some long-term faith in it, you know.
I couldn't say it better. Thank you so much for that eloquent description of the importance of process.
Local emotions.
Without process, you don't get what you want. That's what I used to say to them, and they used to kind of struggle with that. They clicked. You want a particular outcome, and you're not going to think about how to get it, you're not going to get it. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.